You're listening to episode 161 of Present Moment. Welcome to Present Moment, Mindfulness, Practice, and Science. I'm Ted Meissner. Present Moment is a podcast with interviews, conversations, and roundtable discussions. We speak with mindfulness researchers about their newest findings published in peer-reviewed science journals, teachers about their understanding and methods as they work with students of mindfulness, authors about their books and interests, and we also speak with everyday practitioners. The website presentmomentmindfulness.com has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Sam Himelstein joins us to speak about trauma-informed mindfulness with teens, a guide for mental health professionals. If you're listening to this podcast and find value and insights from what is shared here, know that this can only be sustained with your generosity. Please take a moment, go to presentmomentmindfulness.com and click on Make a Donation if you value these conversations, which can't continue without your contributions. Thank you for your help and your support. Working with younger participants of mindfulness programs or treatments presents some unique challenges, requiring unique skills and experience. There is an additional layer of complexity when those teens also have a history of trauma. Our guest today specializes in exactly those conditions. Sam Himelstein, PhD, is a licensed psychologist, public speaker, and author who specializes in working with adolescents and their families via private practice, community organizations, and in juvenile justice settings. He travels the world offering workshops on related topics and lives in Oakland, California. Note that Sam's book, Trauma-Informed Mindfulness with Teens, is discounted through the publisher through the end of 2020, so please be sure to click on the link provided on the episode page. Our guest today, returning to the podcast, is Sam Himelstein. Sam, welcome back. Good to see you again.
Thanks so much for having me. Really excited to be here.
So it literally has been 4 years since you've been on this podcast. So why don't you spend a little time, just catch us up on what's been going on for you during that time?
Yeah, for sure. It's been a while. Over the past 4 years, it's been kind of an exciting ride to me. I think the thing that's the same as probably when we last met was that I'm still extremely passionate about and spend a lot of my time working with young people, trauma-impacted folks in the juvenile justice system, young people that are impacted by addiction and just other kind of hardships in life. And I'm still just extremely passionate and spend a lot of my time doing and thinking about how to bring mindfulness and other self-awareness and contemplative practices to those populations. And, probably the biggest change is that I have successfully been able to leave my full-time positions. I was probably working as a maximum security clinician in the juvenile hall the last time we met. And what happened from there was I got recruited from a chemical dependency hospital, a hospital with a chemical dependency program. And that felt really good to get recruited, and did a couple of years there. And, I just kept doing trainings and online trainings, and the demand kept getting more and more to the point where I could leave my full-time positions as a clinician. And what I did was I essentially used the Center for Adolescent Studies as a way to launch that. And of course, I still have a private practice. I still see people clinically, and I still work in a few different juvenile hall systems, actually just on a very kind of contract part-time basis, really focusing on teaching mindfulness and trauma informed skills and things like that to the youth themselves, which has been really, really fun. So yeah, I mean, it feels like there's been a lot of growth, and I'm very happy and blessed to be where I'm at today, particularly with a lot of the online growth that I've been able to do. Um, and the traveling that I've been able to do to kind of train professionals and also work with youth in different systems, different community-based organizations, different youth correctional organizations across the country. And that's, how I spend a lot of my time. And I'll just kind of end this first part by saying I say all the time at my talks, I love my number one passion is working with youth and teaching mindfulness to youth and people really, of course, but youth is kind of my thing. And then very close second is talking about it. And so that's why I'm super happy to be here. And that's why I love to do trainings and speaking engagements too. So
Thank you for that catch up, and glad to hear that things have been going well. It
yeah.
sounds like there's been an appetite for the work that you do, which is not surprising.
Yeah.
And some things have shifted a little bit. I think that we've had several episodes for this podcast about trauma sensitivity and mindfulness, and I'm wondering if you've been seeing a rising interest and understanding of what that is.
Yeah, absolutely. I think first and foremost, the interest in just kind of trauma informed care, broadly defined, I've seen that really explode in both, the therapy world, which it's always kind of been there in the therapy world in many regards, but just at a mass level, it's kind of expanded. And then absolutely in the education and the juvenile justice and other sectors as well. And I think absolutely within kind of the mindfulness field, and particularly in the youth mindfulness field as well, it's a huge interest. I have a colleague that I don't know if you interviewed him or not, or probably know about his work, but he wrote the book Trauma Sensitive Mindfulness. And, I became friends with him, and there's a lot of interest in that work as well, just because it's clear that while mindfulness and mindfulness practice is extremely powerful and has the potential to be transformative, there's also some kind of important guidelines to be when you're working with somebody who is severely traumatized, of which a lot of the folks that I have worked with have been, and that's where my interest in it really came from.
And it's an area in mindfulness that has, until fairly recently, not been very well understood. I think not been very well trained, with some notable exceptions on that. And so I'm glad to see that shifting, because it doesn't need to be full-blown PTSD as a diagnosis. It can be simply having gone through recent significant loss, or having some symptomatic signs of trauma. And also, I'm also wondering, from what you're seeing, about a change in perspective on mental health and mental illness. It seems that the culture has gotten a little bit more accepting of that. It's not quite there yet, but I'm curious how it's been for you. What have you observed?
Yeah, I would corroborate that. It feels like the stigma is slightly going down. It's definitely still there, just depending on the community, depending on who you're talking to. But certainly, the idea that, I work with I was on the last day before shelter in place happened here in California. Or excuse me, the last business day. So this was Friday, March 13th. I was running a day-long mindfulness program in the youth prison, and we were talking about PTSD. And it was a really, really interesting program, because these were not clients of mine. They were young people who were going to get a certificate to be peer mentors. So I was kind of like, working with them as I usually work with youth, but also working with them as I usually work with professionals when I'm training them. So it was a really interesting situation. And we were talking about PTSD, and one of the things that came up was the stigma around it, and just this idea of being in therapy and counseling and all these things. And so I was talking with them about it, and this idea came up around how if you have PTSD, or just because you have trauma, just like you said, doesn't mean you have full-blown PTSD. And just because you've experienced a traumatic event doesn't mean you're traumatized or this broken person, or crazy, quote unquote, as a lot of people might think. Um, and so, talking with them about that was very interesting, because maybe about 10 years ago, doing the same exact thing, there would be a lot more resistance in that room to even having the conversation around it. So that's one of the places I've seen where it's like, of course, there's still stigma there, but, it's relaxed in some ways, and of course, can't speak for everyone, but that's been my experience.
Yeah, to see that growth and that acceptance that this is a thing that happens, traumatic events happen,
Hmm.
and how we process them
Hmm.
can lead towards doing fine and getting back to a state of homeostasis, a balance, or dysregulation. That's correct.
Right.
How we work with that when it happens. So glad to see that shifting a bit. So your new book, and I mentioned this at the very beginning of the podcast, but for those who are listening, Trauma-Informed Mindfulness with Teens, a guide for mental health professional. That brings, just in the very title, brings in two more aspects to this territory of trauma-informed work. Is first for teens, and that this is a guide for mental health professionals. Those are two different spins on this territory, which each are very important and have their own contributions to make around this. I'm wondering if you might say a little bit about how important trauma sensitivity is, and being trauma informed is when working with youth in particular.
Yeah, it's absolutely extremely important. I think for me, as I was saying before, the really impetus for me into this is that I was and am passionate about working with young folks. And I've worked with a lot of young folks in the juvenile justice system, foster care system, lots of different systems, right? And that means that I was working with a lot of trauma. And I learned early on that if I'm going to be effective at all with these folks that I'm working with, and of course, this is, paralleled in my work with adults as well. But if I'm going to be effective, then I need to get some training in not just trauma informed care, which I really like to kind of define as like the base level, like don't make it worse in a way, right? But also trauma specific treatment in many ways, right? And so along that path, I was, because of my own upcoming, because of some of the own troubles I got into, because of my own, I guess you could say, spiritual path in a sense, I was introduced to mindfulness and mindfulness meditation at a young age. So I was hooked into it because it had been very, very transformative for myself. And I wanted to share that with the youth I was working with, who, of course, after building a relationship with them, after building some trust, they trusted me enough to say, yeah, I'll try a technique or something like that, And I had a bunch of experiences very early on where it was clear that just, and this is not an absolute rule or anything, but just doing a very formal, conventional mindfulness meditation could bring up some problems with somebody who has some significant trauma or PTSD type symptoms. I was working with a lot of young folks who had experienced community violence, for example, who had been shot at or shot themselves or lost somebody to gun violence or something like that. And a number of experiences where it was like, I just don't even feel comfortable closing my eyes, for example, because when I do that, and when, status quo for these young people is like, it's kind of chaotic inside. And when I do that, and when I start to when I close my eyes and I start to bring some sense of equanimity, it gets a little scary, and sometimes flashbacks and images can come up. So that this is just one, very, I was going to say general, but I guess it's a specific example of how not thinking about trauma-informed guidelines or being sensitive to trauma could actually backfire in some ways when you're trying to help somebody learn a new practice. Just something as simple as saying it's okay to actually keep your eyes open if that's what you need to do to feel safe in this moment is a very kind of, low level but still powerful trauma informed guideline, which I think a lot of practitioners I know who don't even have trauma informed guidelines in the forefront of their mind still do stuff like that, or teach that way, just because it's also very relational and invitational rather than demanding, you know. But when you're working with young people, or when you're working with anybody who has that much trauma, it's important to bring it to the forefront and just be much more intentional with it, because the idea is, you know, we want to help them create a sense of safety first and foremost with us in the relationship, whether it's a one-on-one situation, a group setting, whatever it is. And then, I mean, the goal is hopefully to help them first learn and then maybe gain a little proficiency in a practice like mindful breathing or body scan or even informal mindfulness practices. So that was kind of, you know, for me, it was like all of these things came together around why it was so important to practice trauma sensitivity and trauma informed care when teaching something like mindfulness, really any therapeutic modality or any contemplative practice. But mindfulness was so big for me in my life that I was passionate about sharing it. And luckily, I've been blessed and honored to have some really good experiences doing that with the youth I've worked with and with the people I've worked with too.
You know, as you were describing that, something that was coming to mind, something else this touches on, is some of the nuance in being a mindfulness teacher, that there are things to learn and know how to do in a way that is invitational, that is creating safe space, and lots of other aspects of just mindfulness teaching alone. Then added in the complexities of trauma informed or trauma sensitive work, doing that right. It brings to mind one of the challenges I see for the general public right now, that anyone can take a weekend program and then start calling themselves a mindfulness teacher. And it's, you know this, I know this, others who've been doing this for a long time are aware that it's more complicated than that. And especially in working with people who may be coming from a place of great suffering.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm wondering if you just would be willing to share some of your thoughts on what are the challenges the general public faces with being able to tell, does the person I'm potentially going to work with know what they're doing?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I mean, I think that's a challenge, you know, definitely. Also, even in the mental health professional world, to many respects, right? Like, you know, that's the kind of the other part of the title that we were talking about had a particular twist on it, and it lines up really well with this topic, which is like, anybody could, I think, fall victim to thinking, oh, I can go take a weekend workshop and be, you know, quote unquote certified. But people who maybe are even more at risk for that are clinicians who don't have training, but because in that respect, but think because they have training in other respects, you know, it may be easier or they may be able to catch on to it. And, you know, I think the risk there is like they're already working with a group of people usually. So it's not like they're going to take a weekend workshop and then maybe become a mindfulness teacher. It's like they may get certified in some way, shape, or form, and they're probably most definitely going to then be teaching people very shortly after that, right? And so it's hard, I think, in, you know, I think there's a lot of tributaries and rabbit holes I can go down with this, but like, I just think there's so many trainings out there. Who do you trust? It's very hard to know. I don't have a good answer for the question of like the challenge that the public faces, but all what I kind of base my own experience off of, and what I try to instill both in the people that I'm working with as a therapist or mentor in that mindfulness teacher role, and the people that I'm trying to train to do that, is that your own personal practice is it's, I mean, I hate to sound super corny with this, but this is a lifelong thing, right? It's a commitment. It's not just a weekend workshop. It's not even just a 10-day retreat, if that's what you're into. Like, those are great too, but that's also not it. It's how do you live this daily, and how do you continuously learn so that you can help others and be in the service of others. That's my personal philosophy with it. And I mean, it is a very like, because I do a lot of day longs. I get hired, for example, to do like, I'll come into an organization, do a day long, do a couple of days things, right? Most of the time, the people that have hired me are very understanding, and I'm very clear, like, this is not, a certification for XYZ, right? This is an introduction. Always I say that. And so I go into these trainings and I'm basically telling these folks, which sometimes can range from people who are very deep in the mindfulness practice and deep in mental health work, or have been an educator for 25 years or something like that, or not. Um, I'm very clear that your own personal practice, this is like the base level that everything else comes from. So that's kind of my response to that. I mean, I just agree that it's a challenge, and it's something that I think, here in the United States and all over the world, really, it's like when you have commodification involved in terms of trainings and things like that, it's difficult to know. Hopefully, though, if you are on the other side of that as the consumer, as the client, as the patient, as the mentee, whatever you are, um, there is a level of trust with the individual and the person first, just as a human being. That's what I would hope for, at least. That's much easier said than done, though, of course. So
In that. So in the book, because this is a book that's geared towards mental health professionals,
hmm
knowing that they may be coming to this with a strong practice of their own, and they may be meditators, or they may be, no, they're mental health professionals. Mindfulness stuff is new. And you're not doing just mindfulness for mental health professionals, it's also trauma-informed mindfulness with teens, no less. So how did you mix all of those ingredients together, knowing that you might have mental health professionals, dedicated, passionate, wonderful people who don't have a foundational understanding of what we mean by mindfulness and how it can help?
Yeah, it feels like in many ways this book is just a convergence in everything I've been training in over the last 15 years or so. Um, I decided to become a psychologist early on, in a mental health professional, and have loved being a therapist. I've been a mindfulness practitioner for a very, very long time. It transformed my life, as I was saying, personally. And I've also been working with trauma impacted youth for a very, very long time too. And so that convergence was just kind of like, and you said this a little bit earlier, but like, this is a very nuanced practice. It's not basic. And because of this idea that mindfulness, of course, I know this, probably all of your listeners may know this as well, but like mindfulness, for example, is much more than just meditation. And it's certainly much more than just mindful breathing meditation, right? And just knowing that sometimes when somebody goes inside, it can feel unpredictable or chaotic, or trigger them in some way. Sometimes it can be a conventional memory of something. Sometimes it's not conventional, and it's just dysregulation. They don't understand why it's coming up, and they have no insight around it. Um, just even knowing that at a base level was like, okay, we want to make sure as mental health professionals, similar to the medical profession, like our ethics code is first to don't hurt anybody, don't do any more harm, right? And unfortunately, if you don't take some of these into account, there is potential to re-traumatize somebody, to trigger them to be more dysregulated after your work with them than before, which puts them more at risk. And so, yeah, it becomes very nuanced, because all of this relies on, for example, I talk about this early on in the book, just the authentic interpersonal relationship. And so, for example, when I first meet any client, but particularly young people in, correctional setting or anything like that, like, I don't just go up to them and say like, I'm a mindfulness teacher, like, let's do this. I build a relationship with them. And I practice what I like to call, and a lot of people call it this, relational mindfulness, which essentially is defined to me as I'm in putting, uh, actual awareness and actual intention into the things that help me build an authentic, trusting, interpersonal relationship with this person, so that they become more receptive to me, so that when I do offer to share this practice with them, there's just much more of a likelihood that they'll be open to it and try it. And if there's more of a likelihood that they'll be open to it and try it, there's more of a likelihood that they'll have an experience with it that could be beneficial with them, which could lead to some proficiency over time, which in some cases that I've been honored to be with, can lead to mastery, and they can get really good at this practice. And so, so that is a big component too, right? It's like, this is just, what I just described is also even just on the level of working with teenagers, whether you're a mental health professional, an educator. I know this anecdotally through my experience, but a lot of research has supported just the idea that when you have a better relationship with the teen that you work with, whatever the outcome is, it's going to be better, whether it's therapy, whether it's grades and in the academic realm, whatever it is. So that's just that one part. That's a huge, huge piece of this, which is a huge kind of like the bedrock in many ways of interpersonal trauma-informed care, at least, which is all necessary for me to get to that point to say, you know, this is what I think might help you. And if they trust me, and I think it really is mindfulness, and mindfulness being defined as the large umbrella, not just meditation, right? Then we can actually get somewhere with it, right? And so again, these are very basic concepts in their respective fields, and they all come together to, even on the basic level, form this kind of nuanced experience of what it means to teach and practice trauma-informed mindfulness with young people, who have been disproportionately affected in some way by a hard experience.
Yeah, thanks for that overview, because there is a lot there, and
Mm-hmm.
it's that capacity to inadvertently, with the best of intentions, nonetheless do harm, because it
Yeah.
just seems like you're getting in touch with whatever the focus of a particular contemplative practice is. But that can be really, really not so good for some
Mm-hmm.
people, and having that understanding is an important first step before you even try it or incorporate it into something you're already doing, particularly if you already know you have uh, a cohort that has been deeply affected by trauma.
Right.
Yeah, so
Right.
thanks for giving that overview. I'm also wondering, what are some of the most important things to remember or do when working with teens who've experienced trauma and may be displaying symptoms of it? What are some things you remind others when you're teaching? Yeah, this is something you got to keep in mind.
For sure. One of them I kind of just reviewed, but relationship first, I think, is really important. I think understanding, Dan Siegel's concept of the window of tolerance is extremely, just wow, that was just a great contribution to the field, to be honest. Understanding that, we have this threshold of this window of tolerance, and that when we're within that, more of a conventional practice may be a little bit more appropriate. And as somebody's sliding down or getting aggravated out of it, then we need to shift a little bit. And you can train yourself to look for those types of cues. When somebody is above the window of tolerance, it's oftentimes a dysregulation in which the central nervous system gets activated, and people can get more aggressive or just be more mobilized in many ways. Whereas when they are uh, sliding down, in a sense, they are detaching, flat affect, dissociative. It's really important to look out for that as well, because a lot of people who run groups with youth, particularly teenagers, it's easier to pay attention to kind of the quote unquote troublemakers, the ones who are loud, the ones who are disruptive. And if you do that, and then you think, oh, that's, little so and so in the corner, they're doing fine because they're not being disruptive. That may not always be the case. And so it's important to know that if somebody is completely checked out, it may be because they're dysregulating down outside of the window of tolerance. So the window of tolerance, I can go on and on for that for a long time. That's another one. I think the I'll keep it simple for the podcast, but the third one, I have, 8 or 9 of these guidelines that I go over, but the third one that I think is really important, we touched on it before. Mindfulness is more than just meditation. And oftentimes, for folks where it's difficult to go inside because of hard experiences, informal and daily practices can be the medium and the doorway to get them practicing. I've had many experiences where it's like working with somebody who trusts me very much, but it's just clear they've been through a lot, and a formal mindfulness meditation isn't going to do it, even if their eyes are open, whatever, right? And so rather than doing that, we took the alternative route, where I help them just develop short moments of awareness through mindful check-ins, through the ability to ground themselves, through the ability to become aware of and articulate their experiences. And even in some of our treatment goals, as therapists, we usually have some form of goal. Just sometimes goal isn't the right word, but just a path that we've co-created with the folks we're working with, right? And I've had many situations like that where, we've had the idea that we want to get there someday of being able to meditate. And with many of those folks who we started with informal practices, just, very basic things, over time with building trust and with their ability to be with themselves without getting too dysregulated, we've gotten them to that point. So so mindfulness is beyond meditation. Mindfulness is more than just meditation would be kind of another big one that I think is important for folks to know.
Yeah. And for those listening, be sure to check out the book itself, because there's more in there. And also I've got links to a couple of other conversations, including one we did a few years ago on building authentic relationships, because that was such an important aspect of this work. That if we can't establish that, the rest is not going to follow as well as it must. So for mental health professionals, are there some things you're seeing happening that you'd like to encourage change or suggest be done differently in some way that you keep running into?
Are you asking about within the realm of mindfulness, trauma, all of the above, or?
All of the above, whatever you're seeing in mental health that is something that maybe we could change that a little bit. What might that be?
Yeah, that's a definitely have an answer. It's a loaded question in many ways that I really appreciate. Well, I think, you kind of alluded to this when we started our conversation today. So trauma is much more than the very specific criteria of post-traumatic stress disorder. And there have been many in the field who have tried and unfortunately not gotten that far with expanding that. A researcher by the name of Bessel van der Kolk has, repeatedly tried to get a diagnosis called developmental trauma disorder in the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which is what we use. Not every therapist uses it like in private practice, but if you're working with insurance, they usually want a diagnosis. And this is where it kind of starts to get a little political, where it's like, we haven't been able to expand this very important but in some ways limited view of what trauma is. Post-traumatic stress disorder, particularly since it came into the DSM, really represented the experiences of men who were war trauma victims, right? A very important thing to represent, because that's will definitely traumatize you. It did not as much take into account the experience of women, the experience of children and teenagers, and it certainly didn't didn't expand to some of the more socio economic layers of trauma and oppression and things like that. And so there's a lot of pioneers right now who are doing some great work in that respect. And one of my wishes for the mental health field at large would be to not cling to this idea that you either fit the diagnosis or you don't, because as we know, the numbers just don't line up. The amount of CPS reports in the United States and the amount of experiences of violence that people go through is extreme, and the rate for formal PTSD in the United States is very, very low. I can't remember the exact statistic, but the numbers just don't line up, right? So that would be one thing that I think would really help the trauma-informed field, and that would, by default also help the trauma-informed and trauma-sensitive mindfulness field too. It just one of the things I see all the time is ADHD-like symptoms that may have their root in trauma. I'm not somebody that believes that ADHD doesn't exist. I do believe that it exists. However, for a time, and probably even still today, it may be highly overdiagnosed. And I think that's because there is a lot of symptoms that can come from developmental and complex trauma that in many ways mimic ADHD symptoms, And so anyways, that's like some of the work that some of these folks like Bruce Perry and Bessel van der Kolk and Lawrence Heller and like all of these, and, Joy DeGruy have really tried to expand the field in that way. And that would be a big hope on my part as well. And I think, on the mindfulness side, and sorry, I'm kind of going on a monologue here.
Keep going.
On the mindfulness side, yeah, it's like sometimes it's kind of like, what is really a mindfulness facilitator, And so how can we as a field really come together and help each other out to just crystallize what the training ought to be, so that there is a little bit more I guess less challenge that we were talking about earlier that the public just faces when they want to know, can I trust this facilitator or not? And I think that, of course, means some training in trauma-informed practices, just unfortunately, given the non-discrimination in which trauma pervades the world, in people's lives. So.
Yeah, beautifully said. Thanks for that. And is there anything else that you want to share with the listeners before I let you go?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that is centralized to the book, and I realized that in my book, and I think my first book, in pretty much all of my online courses, the last thing I talk about is just like self-care and resilience on the part of the therapist or educator or mindfulness teacher, and I just want to kind of leave folks with that I think that is probably the most important thing in this practice. I mean, I think it's what makes the best facilitators. I think it's what makes the best therapists. I think it's what makes the best trauma providers and folks who practice trauma-informed care, is those who really take self-care and resilience in themselves seriously, which a mindfulness practice can be a big part of that, right? It is for me personally. When you do that, you show up more as your best self, as your most attuned self, and you're better able to serve those folks around you. And I think the reason that this is big for me right now is as we're going through this, unprecedented pandemic, people are dealing with a lot of change and a lot of unpredictability. And that is in many ways paralleled for folks who've been traumatized. Either their central nervous system is chaotic and unpredictable, or their external environment is chaotic and unpredictable. And not all of my patients right now, but a number of them, interestingly, are not that affected by this pandemic because their central nervous system, because their whole life has been chaotic. The outside world is finally just reflecting what they've been feeling, right? And of course, this is not everybody. I just want to say that again. But it just makes me think we're in a time where it's so important, more so than any other time, to have these practices for ourselves, to model it for the people we work with, and especially if we're going to teach it to the folks that we work with, that self-care and resilience should be number one, whatever that means to you. For me, that's mindfulness is a very, very big part of that. But I think I just want to end with that, because I realize in all of my courses, it's like the last thing I focus on, because one of the things I want to leave people off with. And recently I've really been thinking, I want to do some stuff where it's the first thing that I focus on and really help bring people through that, because it is that important. So I think, that's probably good in terms of leaving off with that for now, at least.
Yeah, and a really good point. Self-care is something that falls off very quickly and very easily and very, very subtly.
Yeah.
I'll often in presentations, I will ask people to think about for just a few minutes how much time you spend during your day taking care of others. We do it as a practice and we go through it, and okay, so make a mental post-it note of what that is. Now think about how much time you spend with that same intentionality taking care of yourself. Again, just notice what it is. There's no wrong answer here. It's just about noticing, see what's here. Again, make a mental note. Most of the time, it's going to come up with people spending a large amount of their time caring for others in some way. And there's lots of different ways that might show up, but not so much taking care of ourselves. And that's something that constantly comes up, is getting worn out. There's empathy fatigue because there hasn't been an understanding of how to rejuvenate oneself, refresh and replenish with compassion and the connection that comes from that, being able to express that and share it. So yeah, I think that is a beautiful point to make, Sam. And for those who are listening, if you'd like to find out more, I'll have a couple of links on the episode page. One is to Sam's website, and another one that he runs as well, and links to the books I've also mentioned here. Our guest today, Sam Himelstein. Sam, thanks so much for being here. Good to see you again.
Thanks so much for having me. Already looking forward to the next one.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come and visit the website at presentmomentmindfulness.com. You'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. You can comment on the episode page and find show notes and other helpful resources for your mindfulness practice. The shakuhachi music heard on Present Moment is used by permission and through the generosity of musician Rodrigo Rodriguez. His website is linked on the Present Moment website on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on Present Moment.